the non-physical might be even more important than the physical, and that there definitely is phenomenon happening there, and sometimes in conjunction with physical. I have had out-of-body experiences, and that, for me, I think is adjacent to the phenomenon, and that's what I've been taught through magic, is to sort of be an atheist towards all this phenomenon stuff and be like, no, it's all explainable.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Watch Mojo and the Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and with me today is a very special guest. I've got Chris Ramsay from the YouTube channel Area52 here to talk about all things UFOs and UAPs. Welcome, Chris. It's great to have a fellow Montrealer with me doing an in-person interview for a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Watch Mojo, obviously a massive channel, so very happy to be able to do this podcast and in person on top of that. I think it's really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So Area 52 isn't the only YouTube channel that you have. You're also a master of illusion and magic and puzzles. Your other channel is absolutely massive. And was that the first YouTube channel that you started?
Yeah, started with magic probably a dozen years ago. And, worked my way up through the ranks of YouTube by posting street magic videos, a lot of which were filmed in Montreal, so which is pretty cool. And after that, sort of shifted over to solving puzzles, which I always thought was adjacent to magic, because we're both, familiar with how things work and methodry and sort of reverse engineering things, which inevitably, brought me into the space I'm in now with Area 52. But it's definitely been a journey going from one to the other, but I think it all sort of had to happen in the way that it did. And so, everything kind of happens for a reason and led me here.
So what was the reason for starting a dedicated channel for UAP stuff?
I wouldn't necessarily call it just UAP stuff. And I'm a UFO guy, so like the UAP stuff kind of spooks me, but I'm a big UFO guy. But I would say, initially, I was always interested in the phenomenon, whether it's alien abductions or just UFO sightings, ever since I was a kid, just really into this stuff, into the unknown, especially, I'd watch Unsolved Mysteries growing up, and, they would talk about spontaneous combustion and all sorts of poltergeist things. And I was always really interested in that stuff. And I think maybe kind of, now that I think of it, maybe even led me into the magic space a little bit. One day I had a friend of mine who is a memory champion, Nelson Dellis. He's a 6-time U.S. memory champ, phenomenal guy, really good teacher of memory stuff. And I had reached out to him because I'd wanted to figure out how to improve my memory for my magic stuff. And so, he taught me how to do mind palaces and how to remember a shuffle deck of cards. And I really worked hard at this and studied this. And then one day Nelson tells me, he's like, hey, I had this group reach out to me on Facebook, on one of these Facebook groups, and they offered me money. In exchange, they wanted to teach me how to remote view. Right. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? I've heard of this stuff before with the Russians. And he goes, yeah, it's a hedge fund that hired this team to teach people how to remote view the stock market. So billionaires are out here recruiting remote viewers to make money. I'm like, this is insane. So all of a sudden, my brain switches from this being completely insane to, wait a second, people are putting money, so there might be something to it. And it led me down a whole path. So for the next year, I studied remote viewing, and I went on this massive journey with Nelson, documented the whole thing in a 3-part series, remote viewed every day, got to speak to, people like Joe McMoneagle, who is a remote viewer 001 for Project Stargate, in conjunction with the CIA, talked to research physicists who work on the project, talked to taskers, all sorts of people involved, even Uri Geller, so I really went on a deep dive. And by the end of it, I was like, I can't put this on my magic channel. People are going to think I'm insane. The whole thing about magic is that there's a method to it. It's all trickery. It's all fake. And that's what I've been taught through magic, is to sort of be an atheist towards all this phenomenon stuff and be like, no, it's all explainable. Suddenly I'm faced with something that's not so easily explained. So I decided, I was like, you know what, this might be a good opportunity. And I was feeling a little bit of a lull with the other content, a big lull actually. And I said now might be a good time for me to pivot into something that I'm really passionate about, even more so than the magic stuff, and also allows me to sort of share my passion for cinematography and storytelling. So that's where Area 52 got started.
Well, that's another thing I wanted to mention is that the production quality of all of your stuff is phenomenal, and you have an incredible setup for your interviews that you conduct. I think you refer to it as the skiff.
Yep.
Which is amazing. So you've really invested a lot of time and energy into that. And I'm wondering, like, since you started off in magic and like illusions, are there any parallels or connections that you've noticed to the UAP world? Because there does seem to be a lot of deception and people have a feeling like they're not being told the entire truth. So what are the connections between the two areas?
Yeah, obviously that's a great point. There are, I often, refer to what people call in the ufology, if that's a word, but the space here, we often talk about psyop.
Yeah.
The word psyop comes up a lot. Like that's a psyop, or he's in on a psyop, or, that type of thing. And I would say magic is like the positive spectrum of what a psyop is, because you're using essentially the same techniques to trick people. You're using psychological techniques, misdirection, subtleties, suggestion, showmanship, all these different things, all these different elements and tools, and you're meshing them, mixing them together to create a psychological event that is different from reality. And obviously, if you use that for fun, it can be a magic trick and everybody's happy and it's a moment of wonder and astonishment. If used negatively, yeah, we've seen, that can be definitely terrible, because you're legitimately messing with people's objective view of reality. And where I do it with magic in the space of fiction, like this is a little fictional bubble we're going to live in for a few minutes, three-letter agencies and other people with more nefarious agendas will use it for, different purposes. And so that is one, I would think, one magic thing that is related. But there are many facets, I think, of all art forms that can sort of relate to each other. But magic specifically, I talk to a lot of experiencers, people who've, whether they've been abducted or whether they've experienced the phenomenon or had some type of psychic event or, any of these things. And I've drawn, in some cases, a similarity between someone experiencing one of these experiences, like the phenomenon, and someone experiencing a magic trick. There's some similarities there. And so, for instance, if a magician performs at a venue, and magicians know this, by the way, will often linger and listen to what the perception of the effect that was performed was from the spectator's point of view, because often magicians are engineering a memory. We're not actually, like, what you're recalling isn't exactly what happened, and we do that on purpose. We include certain subtleties so that your brain puts together a process image of what the experience felt like, and it isn't exactly objective. And so I feel like that sometimes happens as well in the experiencer realm, and it's not because people want to lie, and it's not because people don't want to be truthful, but it's human nature. So we see two different reasons for this happening. One, when you experience a magic trick and try to tell somebody about it, or a UFO, you're going to embellish a little bit. And the reason for that is, one, you don't want to appear like you're easily fooled, right? You want to kind of knock out the things that people are going to instinctively try to use to debunk this story. So you'll say something like, no, it didn't make a sound, even though you were in your car, right? Things like this. And then just because you know that it felt like it didn't make a sound. And in magic, the same thing. You don't want to appear like you were easily fooled. So you'll layer it a little bit more. You'll round off the edges. And these little fibs and stuff will start to create a more impossible image. Because the second reason, you want them to feel like they were there. When you're telling a story to someone, it isn't about conveying words or data. It's about conveying emotion. And so when I'm telling you a story, I'm trying to make it as though you were there. And if I just give you the facts, it's going to feel underwhelming. And so I want to pad it a little bit. And I want to say, no, you don't understand. it was there for 4 minutes, even though it was 30 seconds. It felt like 4 minutes, so these things will start to layer on and on. So I do see that, but that's not to say that these things don't happen. And that's the important distinction between a lot of magicians where they'll stop it. No, it's all explainable. Just because you have an explanation for something, it doesn't mean that that's how it's done. And so I think using my discerning magician mind to peer a little deeper into the phenomenon is actually going to help me figure out what's going on, but it might not help me sort of really understand the phenomenon any more than I do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. It kind of reflects a little bit what the experiencers might be feeling from the perspective of somebody who puts people in those positions intentionally.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Have you had any experiences yourself in your own life?
Yeah, experiences. I've had a certain amount of sightings that to me were anomalous, and whether those pilots of these crafts were of extraterrestrial origin, or whether it was advanced tech, or whether it was just a misidentification of something prosaic, I don't know, and I can't be sure. I'm not that smart, I don't consider myself an expert by any means in terms of like telemetry or what's been going on in the skies, but I know enough to, when I see something and I can't explain it, to film it. And I've done that a few times. I filmed this object as I was flying to LA. We were going over right near Nellis Air Force Base, which is an interesting spot in Nevada, and there was this tic-tac-like object, this giant tube, just sort of hovering there. I don't know if it was moving. It's hard to tell because the plane's moving, but it felt like it was just kind of like there. And it didn't have, from my perspective, any wings or any tail. It was just this tube, and I filmed it. And, I'll give you that footage. You can put it up here. But it seems to be like some type of, tube or tic-tac, or maybe a blimp even. Could be a blimp, or some type of weird weather balloon. So, as far as to say, oh, that's definitely a reptilian Pleiadian craft, I have no idea, but it looks anomalous. And I also filmed what I saw to be like a triangular formation of lights with a green light in the middle, fly right over my car. And as I went out to film it, 2 lights went out, and now it's just 2 lights, and it's just going, and they're not flashing. I filmed the tail end of that. So, what those are, I don't know. Wishful thinking. I do want them to be UFOs, and I want them to be piloted by, some weird mantis-looking creature. That'd be amazing. But in reality, I'm still trying to see it for myself. Yeah. I have had out-of-body experiences, and that, for me, I think is adjacent to the phenomenon. And that's a whole other thing that I ended up getting into. But yeah.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because you mentioned remote viewing being kind of the entry point into starting Area 52. And so that was your springboard, and you've covered many other topics with your channel. So, it's, again, UFO adjacent, but it's kind of coming into the conversation now because there's been talks from whistleblowers about psychic phenomena being intimately connected to UAPs and interactions with them. So what have you learned about that through people you've spoken to and research you've done for your channel?
Yeah, well, actually, it's actually been closely tied into the phenomenon ever since the beginning of the phenomenon, and especially regarding experiencers. Most of the experiences that people have had with interactions with extraterrestrials or seemingly extraterrestrial entities during these abductions, a lot of times have been non-physical. And, that's a big pill for a lot of people to swallow, to think that something to be real has to be physical. Like, that's where most people's heads are at. They're like, well, if it's not physical, it's not real. And most people who study this stuff, and parapsychologists as well, they understand that the non-physical might be even more important than the physical, and that there definitely is phenomenon happening there, and sometimes in conjunction with the physical. So where some experiencers might literally have a physical altercation where they're inside of a craft taken from their bedroom and interacting with these other creatures, and they can smell them, they can touch and see them. And then other times the same experiencer will be taken out of his or her body, and brought onto the craft. And, so these are things that you hear, people like John Mack, David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, John Carpenter, so many researchers have looked into this, and it seems, undeniable that there definitely is a non-physical component to the phenomenon. Now, once you get into the non-physical, that's where we start talking about all the ESP stuff as well. Start talking about, telepathy, telekinesis, bilocation, all sorts of different phenomenon that revolve around sort of cerebral manipulation of our reality. And now we start talking about the psionics program, and you start hearing about things like Skywatcher and Jake Barber and these guys who are trying to, quote unquote, summon or invite crafts into the vicinity with the intention of taking them down, and all this. So even Roswell, there's been reports, I think, from Philip Corso in his book, The Day After Roswell, which he said that there were these headbands that these little creatures had. And these headbands were the key to controlling the craft, in that, perhaps the U.S. government's been reverse engineering this sort of psionic technology. And for those who don't understand what the word psionic is, it's a made-up word. Most words are made up, but it's a made-up word from old sci-fi, actually. And it's basically how technology can interface with the mind through a psychic connection. So that is the word psionic. When we say it's psionically controlled, that's usually a tech involving the brain.
Right. Yeah, I spoke to Jake Barber and Matthew Pines, Skywatcher, and the work they're doing is super interesting, and I can't wait till the next part of their video series comes out, because that's going to focus on the psionic component of it. They've already detailed the machine calling, where they use frequencies.
The dog whistle
thing. And the next one is going to be about the psionic, assets that they use. So yeah, super fascinating. What about the out-of-body experiences, like from your end? I know I've spoken to, for example, Whitley Strieber, who talked about one of his abduction experiences tying into out-of-body stuff, particularly in dealing with the Greys. And has there been any entities attached to this with you? What have you experienced?
One time, I've had like a half a dozen out-of-body experiences in the last maybe year and a half. It happened sort of spontaneously twice, 2 nights in a row, where I had quit. I used to smoke weed recreationally, and I'd quit for like a week, and I still, haven't gone back to it. But after that week, there's something that happens when you stop consuming recreational drugs or alcohol, which is something called REM rebound. And sort of apparently the REM that you have to induce these, REM states during sleep builds up like water behind a floodgate. And after about a week, it starts to release, and you start having the really vivid, crazy, lucid dreams. I didn't know that. And about a week in, and this is also about a month after I met with Joe McMoneagle, and he told me about Monroe Institute and astral projecting and all this stuff. And I had no idea what any of this was. So I'm here in my bed, and I'd taken a melatonin before bed because I was like, I just can't sleep because of the habit and everything else. And so I took this and had this weird, crazy nightmare. Woke up from it, remember peeling my eyes open, being in my room. It's all fuzzy and gray and low saturation. And there's this intense humming vibration that I'm feeling in my body. And it's very strange. And I feel like I could just lift up and I just start floating. And it was terrifying. I was about 3 feet over the bed and I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, it's not a dream. This is real. I'm actually doing this. And I got incredibly scared, fell back down, sort of came to and was like, what the heck was that? My heart was pounding. And so the next night I was like, you know what, let me try this again. That was kind of cool. I want to see if that can happen again. And so I did that again. Same thing, same symptoms. And now I'm up over my body and I turn around and now I see myself. And so I didn't realize I was out of body. I just, was floating. And now I realize I'm laying there and I'm seeing myself with my eyes closed. And if that's just a sheer moment of terror in itself, you can ask the audience when the last time it was that they saw themselves with their eyes closed, other than a picture or video. You can't look at yourself in the mirror and close your eyes. So seeing that was terrifying. It was just, it just stopped me in my tracks, and incredible fear. And it went back down to my body, actually went lower than my body, which scared me even more. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you can go down. Like that's crazy, So I'm scrambling to get into my body. And then I come to, and I spent the next week just scouring the internet for what had happened to me. Because I was convinced that I've lucid dreamed before. And I was convinced that this wasn't a dream. And from hearing testimony from so many other people who share the same symptoms, I was now convinced that I had a spontaneous out-of-body experience. And so I started looking into it more and more, found out that the CIA back in the 70s, actually prior to that, the CIA were heavily involved in sort of the consciousness space. And prior to Stargate, they had all sorts of projects. And prior to, they had Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, like all these remote viewing psychic things, and then eventually they had this gateway process, basically, where they hired Robert Monroe, who was a sound engineer back then, who'd written a book, Journeys Out of the Body. And they tried to come up with this protocol to teach the CIA members how to leave their body, to see if it could be good for their intel, if they could get, more accurate remote viewing sessions and whatnot. So anyways, I stumbled on the Monroe Institute, this thing that Bob Monroe made. And they had like weekly retreats, but the process was unknown to people. Like it was a secret. It was like trade secret, I guess. And I'd reached out to them, and I Paul Citarella, the VP, he was very kind. And at first he was a little reluctant, and then came back to me and said, you know what? Because I'd asked him if I could document it. And he said, you know what? Let's do it. Let's do like a creator gateway where we get all these other creators in the space and help spread the word about, this out-of-body experience and hopefully attract more people. I said, yeah, cool, fine. Went there for a week, meditated, it's like 5 to 7 hours a day of, these binaural beats, and you're in this whole thing, and it's really cool. And had some cool experiences there, documented the whole, journey, and then went home and started meditating an hour every day for like 3 months at like 4:30, 5:30 in the morning. And after 3 months, I had started leaving my body pretty regularly. Like it happened another like 4 times after that. And the last time to get to your question, if I met any entities, the last time that it happened was a daytime meditation. It was 5:30 a.m. Sun was peering in through my window, broad daylight. I have no curtains in my room. And I put my headphones on. I listened to an hour of the sort of gateway stuff, the hemisync stuff. And after an hour, I'm feeling super mellow. I'm literally like fuzzy on the inside. I'm like, oh, this is great. I put the headphones down. I lay down. I close my eyes, and I say to myself, this would be the perfect time to leave my body. Because I was lucid, I was awake, but I was relaxed. And so I remember saying to myself, I deeply desire to leave my body 3 times. And on the 3rd time, I feel what I experienced and what I described to be a phasing. It's sort of where your body starts vibrating like a hum. And let's say this is your body, and this is, we call it your consciousness or your soul body, or it starts doing this. And I start floating within my body, and I feel that. Again, my eyes were open 5 seconds ago. And now I'm in this state, and I'm thinking, holy shit, it's happening. We're going to leave the body. This is great. And I'm lucid. Like it's daytime. And so I remember trying to peel my eyes open, but it was like too bright, and that would wake me up. So I closed my eyes again, and I was still here. And I remember somebody at the Institute tell me, you can demand clarity if you're in that state. So I just said clarity now in my head, but like this big booming voice, this deep voice, was like clarity now. I was like, oh my God, it scared me. And I could just start seeing through my eyelids. Now I'm like, I'm happy, but I'm terrified. And I'm like, oh my God, this is happening. So I leave my body. I kind of look, I see myself. I don't want to look at myself. It's a scary thing to see. So I kind of get up and I walk towards my window, and another trainer, Arky, he had told me you can start by putting your hand through the window, baby steps, because he was scared too. He had the same fear as I did. And he's like, 1 foot in front of the other, and just, try a little bit and go back to your body and try it again later. And so I'm there, and I'm like, oh my God, and I see my window, and I go, and it doesn't go through. And I'm like, oh no. And so I'm like, all right, well, just, it's broad daylight. It's like beautiful out. So I I open the window and I go to jump out. And as I'm halfway out, I hear a female voice. I don't know who this is. I've never heard this voice in my life, coming from behind me. And it goes, "What are you doing?" And I go, "Oh," and I'm like, my shoulders are tense. I'm like terrified because I thought, I was already scared to be in this realm, but now I'm hearing something as clear as day. So instead of turning around to see what said that, I just kind of I'm like, nope. And I see my body. I'm like, I'm going to go right back in my body. And I just lay down and I get back up. And that was like a minute and a half of time between where I closed my eyes and where I came back in my body. So I never fell asleep. I was lucid the entire time. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, I think there's something really here. And for me, I'm not out to convince anybody of this. It's not my goal. But for me, it was validation that I'm like, oh, snap, something, I'm more than my physical body. I now believe that. Yeah.
Wow, a minute and a half is not a short amount of time for an experience like that. It must have felt a lot longer to you while you were in it, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Time behaves a little differently. I can't really tell you, but I remember that at 6, it was 5:30 when I put my headphones on, and it was like 6:35 when I put my head down. It was like 6:37 when I got back up. So it was like I was cognizant of the time. I kept checking the time, and so that was something, because I was worried that I was going to look at the time, and it was 3 hours later. I was like, oh, that was all just a dream.
Yeah. And you were able to open your window with your astral body?
But the window was obviously not open in the physical world, but in this astral world. And if you read, Journeys Out of the Body and all these other books about out-of-body experiences, and people who've had them know this as well, when you're out of body, that world isn't an exact match. It's like an 80% match. It's kind of akin to the Upside Down in Stranger Things. Yeah, it's kind of that. And it is as spooky, as eerie, no weird, creepy vines, but definitely maybe entities and that type of thing. According to Bob, Monroe. And, but it's funny that we're talking about this because 3 nights ago, I started doing the hour-long meditations again in hopes of maybe communicating with something. So that's been my goal. I've been, every day, just 1 hour a day at least, meditating on this. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So how has this practice changed your outlook, I guess, on life, on the world, on reality, in conjunction with all the interesting people that I know you've spoken to, like from the start of your channel until now? How much has your perception on reality changed?
Yeah, it's broadened quite a bit. And I think that that's healthy. I think, when you hear a lot of this information and we're coming up on a half an hour on this podcast, if you're still here, there's a good chance that you're into this stuff. And for those of you listening, I mean, you probably understand also that there's a lot of people in your life that are very dismissive of this. And there's sort of 3 ways that you can take in this information. You can either ignore it, you can try to fit it into the current model, which is what most people do. It's a weather balloon, it's swamp gas, you were hallucinating, it was a dream, right? That's kind of, and sometimes it is those, right? And that's where it gets a little hazy. But then the third part is really broadening your worldview and, looking at the data and saying, hey, this isn't consistent with my current model. This is anomalous. Let's look further into it. And so I think I think like anything in life, the more you look into something, you don't find yourself with all the answers. You find more questions.
Yeah, definitely. The more you know, the more you realize how little you know.
That's correct. Yeah.
At the point that you're in now, what are the topics that you're most interested in exploring on your channel?
Good question. Experiencers, I think, I have this fascination with the alien culture. Like, what is that? And the different varieties of species we hear about. Even Eric Davis, who's a renowned physicist, worked for the government for 26 years, had recently spoken to congressional members and told them about reptilians and insectoids. And that's what piques my curiosity. But also specifically people who've been taken. It's one of those topics, and you'll, as you're exploring this field as well, you'll realize that the UAP people, they don't want to talk about this. You're gonna talk to all these people, and they're gonna go, yeah, we don't know. But this, maybe they'll talk about cattle mutilations a little bit, which also happens a lot, even in Canada. We're no strangers to it. It's a wacky phenomenon that's been happening, for over 100 years. But these things I don't think they're just uncomfortable talking about. I think that it's just not part of the plan. I think it's not part of whatever slow drip we're being fed right now. And in my opinion, if you want to know what the inside of a UFO looks like, or if you want to know what an alien smells like, or is wearing, or what he's doing or thinking, you can ask people like Bob Lazar, or people who've worked on legacy projects, or, you can talk to one of the tens of thousands of people who claim that they've had, experiences being abducted by extraterrestrials. And I think that for me is just clear as day. The most important thing right now is to listen to people, not to judge, and definitely not to jump to conclusions. I'm not here to provide an answer. I'm not here to, I spoke recently about this, but like, I don't believe in believing anymore. I don't really care about belief. I just want to absorb information, have low conviction on everything. But then as information starts happening, you start making connections. Things start popping up and you start going, oh, these 7 people said the same thing and they don't know each other. And now we're slowly forming a hypothesis. So I don't want to fall into a camp of, you believe this guy, that means you don't believe that guy. And like this, I think it's a detriment to, information. I think we have to really, put our egos aside, not commit to anything wholly, and just let the information come in and see what we can uncover. And I think a lot of the really good researchers of the past were able to do that and really suspend any personal bias or, objective view that they've had in order to, hopefully further their knowledge into the phenomenon. So that's, for me, I think paramount is the experiencer stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think a lot of people have skepticism about experiencers because it's very easy to just make up a story and then get attention for it. Whereas with the UFO, UAP people, especially the ones that come from military and government backgrounds, there is documentation about kind of who they are. And so that lends a little bit more confidence in what they're saying. But at the same time, you do get the idea that they're holding a lot back. We're not getting the whole truth.
Yeah.
And many people have said that disclosure, capital D disclosure, is not going to come from the government or the military, but it's going to come from the public demanding the truth and sharing stories. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think disclosure is a personal thing. I don't think it can be given to you in a redacted file or scripture or from a witness or even a sighting. I think if you don't want to believe something, you're going to see something out there and you're going to explain it away. It's not going to give you disclosure. You're just going to have more questions. And so I think disclosure is a personal trajectory that everybody has individually. And I think just talking about it and making this conversation a little bit normal to at least have, and again, doesn't mean we have to believe anything. Let's just have the conversation. It's interesting. A lot of people are talking about it. Let's talk about it. And I think that will soften the blow. And, the last thing we want is for everyone to experience ontological shock, right? That's the last thing the government wants. That's why they're kind of like, oh, here, take this and this. But at the same time, I think if everybody out there is on their own personal quest, then that shock gets mitigated over time as you start listening to more people who are sincere, not people who are telling you files they saw on a computer. We're talking about people who can look at you in the eyes, tear-filled, and say, this happened. Something happened to me. And I think when you speak to enough people, it starts to change something within you. It isn't sudden. It's a slow burn over time. And I think it's a personal thing. I think everybody is going to come to that in their own time with the help of podcasts like this and the stuff that I do. I think it's very important that we further the conversation. And, if you want to talk about it in a military sense or in a more sort of esoteric sense, as long as we're talking about it, I think it's healthy. Where that leads us, we'll see. But I think, we should all just get on the same page and slowly start to come to terms with the fact that this is a reality.
Yeah. Did you ever experience any sort of ontological shock, or has this kind of just always been part of your life, part of your interests, and so that kind of like bypassed you?
Yeah, good question. I don't feel like there was a moment that I didn't believe, really. I always, like, even though I was skeptical towards like psychic stuff in the past, mediumship, and these, and still am to a certain degree. There was, when I was a kid, I was watching like Unsolved Mystery. I remember I was 9 years old, and my brother popped in Fire in the Sky, the famous Travis Walton abduction story that was, over dramatized, obviously. But right at the top of that movie, it goes, "This is based on a true story," and so immediately my 9-year-old impressionable little sponge brain goes, "Wait, aliens are real. An adult is telling me that this is true." And since then, I was like, this is now a thing I have to deal with. And that's, I think, where my fascination with the aliens started, because especially in that movie, I was like, they didn't even talk to him. Why wouldn't they tell us what they're doing? That's how rude. They can just go about their day and just like drop you off and not tell us like what's going on up there. Yeah, I want to know more. And so I think over time, reading lots of books on the matter, you don't have the luxury of like disbelieving anymore. It's like you have to, really broaden your worldview. And so that worldview day to day keeps broadening. Yeah.
What theories do you subscribe to as far as the intent of aliens that would be visiting?
It's a working theory, but I think, and again, I don't want to go so far as to believe that this is it, but what it seems to be from what I've read and what I've seen is that we might be interacting at least half the time, maybe 50 or 60% of the time, with some sort of system that's in place. And, there are corroborating pieces of data. There's, the guy came out on 4chan, and I know people are going to be like, 4chan, but, this guy said a lot of things about there being an underwater mobile construction unit in the Atlantic that would create these craft and shoot them out into, deploy them into places that they were in need. And aboard these craft were these entities who were kind of robotic and, almost like robots, like drones, and nothing else, sort of built to spec in this craft, nothing else. And so for me, all of that, even the abduction side of things, you hear most of the abductions, like the smaller grays, will be task oriented, no feelings involved, kind of move robotically, almost insect-like. And then the taller grays, the ones performing the procedures, will be a little more empathetic and or a lot more empathetic, will induce sort of empathy in you, induce these really intense feelings. And so and then, they take you aboard, they do the experiments or they do the procedures. Then they give you a tour of the ship for some reason. You're always given a tour of the ship or shown like a beautiful nebula or something. And then they show you the most horrific images you've ever seen in atomic explosions and like famine. And everybody from Whitley Strieber, Chris Bledsoe, to all these people have experienced this. All the kids at Rua, Zimbabwe, in 96 or whatever, 94. So that to me strikes me as like some type of automated immune response. There's this thing called the von Neumann probe, which is this idea that like we would send out a probe to space that would colonize it. It would have everything in that probe that if it lands on a planet with atmosphere and the right conditions, it would start colonizing it with maybe AI or maybe like genetics or whatever. If that were us, that's something we'd be doing. We wouldn't be, it's almost futile to go to a planet to live underground. Like, what a waste. And for the most part, all the exoplanets that we're observing won't have the right conditions. Too much radiation, too much gravity, not enough oxygen, or whatever it is. And so we'll always have to wear a suit. So it would make way more sense to take the native species, the primitive native species that already lives there on that planet, and genetically modify them with our seed, and then help them overcome these hurdles over time to sort of sustain ourselves throughout the universe. And if I were to do that, I wouldn't be monitoring everything all the time. It's an awful lot to monitor. Maybe there's 100 million planets like ours. And so I would have a system in place that monitors that. That would be controlled intelligently through this, maybe in the quantum field through like AI. I don't even know. But this system, I deploy them in the oceans. And if ever something pops off, like they would deploy things, shut down the nukes or, and go right back. Or sometimes they would have people on board because they have to do genetic alterations. Maybe they collect flora and fauna, and alter them. Maybe they'd bring it in from other planets, coming and going, bringing different seeds to here. And, we have cephalopods and praying mantis here and horses and people and monkeys. It's so vast, and all the Venus flytraps, and like, it's such a weird amalgamation of everything that you're like, yeah, it would make sense that this might just be some zoo that they're populating and that they're just taking care of. And much like a zoo, we dress up as pandas to not disturb the pandas' mating rituals or habits, right? We don't want to interfere with how they're going to procreate. I mean, it makes sense that they wouldn't want to interfere that much, but it also makes sense that they would take us out and tag us, run a couple tests, make sure we're doing okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's also the question of like, well, for example, how many insects have you killed by accident just walking on the sidewalk, like not paying attention to where you're going? Maybe, when we talk about, like, a lot of the time things get framed as a threat, like they could be a threat to us, to our, it's in a national security sense, spoken about a lot of the time. But maybe part of the threat is also just that, it may not be intentional, but we might just be in the way of some of their operations sometimes. Like that could be a reason why sometimes people get harmed, or people have stories of like very negative experiences with them too.
Yeah, we say it's a threat, but where are they showing up? They're showing up at our sensitive military installations, usually probably with nuclear arms. Or, even in Langley, they had, that's where all the F-22's are, and something hung out in the air there for 19 days in a row. Well, that's the largest deposit. Like, it's a very sensitive military installation. So, and even if you look at what Jake Barber's doing with Skywatcher, they're essentially out there, I'm sure, simulating war games, right? Which would trigger this autoimmune response from this system, right? So, because if you were dealing with an intelligent species and I simulated a war game and they came once and we shot them down, they're not going to come twice. They're intelligent. Way more, it would seem, right? So, like, fool me once, you know what I mean? But they're not coming back. So what is the reason they're coming back? Well, it does seem like, again, we're interacting with a system. We found a loophole in the programming to where if we blow up enough things or jeopardize people's lives enough, perhaps stress inoculation or these type things, it signals something to where they have to now deploy something to make sure everything's okay. So that, to me, seems a little bit more of what's going on. And that would explain, why we see so many of these Foo Fighters during, war-like scenarios, whether it's real war or, made-up war.
What do you make of the stuff that's been officially disclosed? Like, we always go back to 2017, the New York Times article with those 3 videos that were kind of like, it was kind of like the first time that this stuff was legitimized to the public. And what would be, in your mind, the reason for doing that if the government doesn't really have too much of an incentive to do so?
I think they do have an incentive to do so. I think that, it could be a million variables at play that I'm not aware of, so I'll caveat it with that. But I think the idea is people are smartening up to this stuff and are coming to their own conclusions if one's not provided. And so the government's always been really good at providing conclusions. And it would be a missed opportunity for them to not at least provide a conclusion, whether that conclusion is right or wrong.
Yeah, that's the big question, because we don't know if it's a case of classic misdirection, as you're very familiar with.
It's always a case of misdirection. But, is it misdirecting us in favor of us or in spite of us? And that's the real question.
Of all the guests that you've interviewed for your channel, Are there any that really struck you or changed your perspective more than anyone else?
James Fox was one of the earlier podcasts I did. James Fox is a filmmaker, made, literally, I think, the best documentaries on the subject, including The Phenomenon and his latest one, The Program, but he also did Moment of Contact. And for me, Moment of Contact was a game changer. This is this crash that happened in Varginha, Brazil in 1996, which was witnessed by a lot of people. Not only that, apparently up to 5 beings roamed this town and were seen and captured by different residents who have been interviewed and who have confirmed, that this happened. One of them even died, in the hospital because of his exposure to like the slime on this being's skin. And then like the smell of ammonia filled the town. In the hospital, they had to shut down for like 5 days because the smell was so bad. But like this case for me, and I feel because it was in my lifetime, I would have been 12 at the time, so that it just makes it feel more tangible. And the fact that there are physical beings and there's a lot of evidence there. So when I heard James talk about it, I saw his movie. I was already convinced that this has happened. To a certain extent, I was like, well, something went on here. Seeing James, seeing his eyes, someone who spent 15 years going back and forth to Brazil and understanding what that man's been through and looking at him and knowing that he knows that it's real. I mean, that left a profound mark on me. Seeing someone who was, all in, heart and soul, this really happened. And that when you're in the presence of that, it does change, it does affect you. And a lot of that is lost on video and even more so on files that are redacted. And so, I always encourage people to like the human experience and emotion can't always be conveyed in these different means. You have to feel it. You have to be in front of the person to feel it. And that's one of the beauties about doing podcasts like this in person and why I value them so much, because I think there's so much information that is unspoken that is more valuable than anything you could say, and I think, James being one of those examples, but, a few others I've felt that in person as well.
It sounds similar to what you said about talking to experiencers before. They have that emotion attached to it because they experienced it themselves. It's kind of similar with James in that he did so much research and immersed himself so heavily into it that he became kind of like an experiencer secondhand.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's well put. That's true. Yeah. You see the mark. Yeah. Even someone who's twice removed from the event is still to a certain extent profoundly affected. Makes you wonder how affected the person, who is holding this being or seeing it, or one of these 3 girls who encountered this little being, how they felt or how they still feel today must be paradigm shifting, to say the least.
I want to read you a pretty heavy quote. I'm sure you're familiar with the videos that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp recently did with Matthew Brown, the guy who's supposedly responsible for the Immaculate Constellation reveal from later last year. So in a very dramatic fashion, they ended off with the quote, "You are not free, and this reality has far more to it than you have been told, and God is real." Mm-hmm. That's a pretty thought-provoking way for them to end their interview. And, you're the second guest that I ask your thoughts on it because I just find it to be very striking. And since you're also into magic and, kind of like creating like this perception of reality, how do you think that ties into the perception of reality that we all have just as human beings?
Yeah, it's a very profound statement. And especially coming from someone who's, seen documents that have, led to these statements, it seems, to hold a lot more weight than if you were to just spout it off randomly. The last part of that is, and God is real. I think that part might be a personal take. This is a fellow Canadian researcher, Darcy Weir, and we had we had a chat and a little bit of a debate online on the Night Shift podcast. He's a great guy. He's very, very well versed, and he's been around this stuff for a long time. But he said something that rang true to me too. Is like it seems more like a statement about somebody who I don't want to presume anything, but a statement by someone who was forced to, who possibly was Christian background and forced now to alter their belief system in a way that still fits the Christian faith.
To kind of integrate it.
Correct. Yeah. And that seems like that was the case. Whereas like, and God is real. And like it was almost like a confirmation for him because he was doubling down on it. So psychologically, I kind of align with that, although, it's hearsay. The first part of it, I think, rang true to me for, various reasons, because it's something that I already believed. And a lot of that coming from the work I did with the Monroe Institute and, leaving my body. I am now convinced, and I wasn't always, I used to be atheist, I'm now convinced that we are more than our physical bodies now. What there is beyond that, I don't know. And I'm probably, not going to find out in this lifetime. But
I think you're finding out more than most people with the out of body experiences.
Yeah. But I mean, it's a personal journey, right? And we're definitely not all on the same journey, and that's something I often have to remind myself too, like when encountering skeptics or encountering people who just don't want to have a conversation or who are trolling or whatever it is. You have to remember that we're all on different journeys. And if this is a question of souls being reincarnated or, what have you, then yeah, maybe we're learning lessons at a different rate, a different pace at a different time, different lessons. And that's okay. And, I think that statement appeals to a lot of people who fundamentally think they have a belief system in place, perhaps like him. And his fundamental belief system and structure was rattled. And I think that's who that statement is for. And I'm assuming, but I can't be certain. But I think for the people who already are in this stuff and have done the research, or moreover, the people who've had experiences themselves already know this to be true, that reality is this isn't it. This is very ephemeral, this lifetime. And what happens non-physically is also reality. And I think we're just conditioned to believe otherwise.
Yeah, this is definitely an interesting thought to finish off that interview. If you could speak to anybody, dead or alive, who would it be for an interview?
Anybody dead or alive? It's a good question. Jesse Marcel Jr. or Jesse Marcel. Yeah. Not Junior, but yeah. Yeah. Guy who's there at Roswell, maybe him. I think he would be an interesting person to have as an interview as far as like a first-hand witness goes. Yeah, I mean, I could think of 1,000 names to be quite frank, but I think, I definitely focus on dead, because alive, I still have a chance to interview them. But who knows? Maybe I have a chance to interview them if they're dead too. The day is young, but yeah, I think Jesse Marcel would be a good one. I'm just trying to think back. I'm fascinated as well by the Aztec crash that happened in Aztec, New Mexico, 8 months after Roswell, 16 bodies. It was an insane thing. Massive cover up, by the way. If you Google it, it's going to say it's a hoax. They did a good job covering it up, but there's a lot of data there, and all those witnesses are gone now. And so maybe to talk to, maybe Silas Newton would have been good, or any of the witnesses there. Yeah. And what they saw, that would probably be a good one too.
What about living people? Who's at the top of your wish list?
I mean, obviously Bob Lazar, Bob's, I got to meet Bob. I got to hang with him, which is, so great. Definitely like a big bucket list moment. But also he's such a great guy. So I was really relieved to know that, there's always in the back of your mind, you're like, what if he's a dick, and he wasn't. He was just a really stand-up guy. Bob, Travis Walton being another one. while he's still around too. That'd be great too. Linda Corteil, I would love to talk to. She's, famously from the book Witnessed or the Manhattan abduction, the Bud Hopkins case, where she was taken out of her apartment, and that was in Manhattan, and it was witnessed by 23 people around town seeing a floating lady out of the building. They made a mockery of it on Netflix. I'll say that publicly.
Okay, I was going to mention there is a Netflix miniseries on that.
First part's great, and they talk to they discredit 3 witnesses out of 23. There's so much more to that story, and and they chalked it up to, I don't know. It was petty how they went about it, but if you read Witness by Bud Hopkins, and you look a little deeper into the story, as if you're a serious researcher, you should. Don't take at face value what a lot of these legacy or now online media companies will tell you about it. Do your own homework, because a lot of times, you'll find that you're being guided into a certain direction, and just tread carefully when it comes to this stuff. You're already studying an anomaly. Why not look at the other anomalous things that are happening within that anomaly? Why just stop there and be like, no, I figured it out? Look deeper. No.
Does it surprise you that public interest about these topics is so high? Like, a lot of people do still, dedicate their lives to like the distractions of the world, social media and sports and entertainment and whatever. But there's growing interest, and I mean, like, both of our channels both of our podcasts are proof of that there is intense interest about this. What do you make of that, and where do you think society is headed?
I think. I think if podcasts were around in the 50s, it'd be much like, maybe even more popular than now. Truth is, you weren't allowed to talk about it, but the buzz was there. Everything happened in the 50s. We had a boom of technology for some reason as well. But it was, it was the talk of the town. All the sci-fi movies coming out and everything. It was, I'd be hard pressed to think that it wasn't as big as it was today. But that being said, where is this going? I just hope that more and more people continue to absorb information. That's it. I don't want anything more, and I don't think we should be doing anything more. Don't look at this in the hopes of getting the answer. Because when you're going to be resigned to an answer, you're automatically going to funnel yourself into a certain way of thinking, and you might miss some details that are really important. So, belief often ends up, distorting your reality to your detriment a little bit too much. So just instead of believing or not believing, let's just keep talking, keep listening, keep having these conversations. I don't have to leave somewhere deciding whether or not I believe someone. Since when does that have to be a thing? Why can't I just be like, thanks for sharing your story and move on? Who cares what I think? Who cares what I think? And what I think, I know, and and you know that 30 years down the line is not going to be the same. So what's the point of saying, this is it? Just listen. Keep listening.
Yeah. I think I definitely agree with that. And from my perspective, I kind of feel like the more people that I talk to, even if 50%, 40%, 30% of what they said is actually true, then that truth will be corroborated by others at some point. And like you said, then you start to build a bit of a mosaic through points that intersect from everybody that you talk to, right?
Yep, exactly. Build up that base of unreliable, even out there information, like really absurd stuff. Listen to it all. Listen to all of it. The stuff that you thought was completely ludicrous. We're talking unicorns and fairies, because there's some work there too. Just listen to all of it. No one's going to think differently of you. Like, I can't stress this enough. You don't have to be religious to read the Bible. And reading the Bible doesn't make you religious, and so go out there and take in information. The more information you have, the better you're going to be for it. And the more, I just think the more educated you're going to be on what it is we're doing here and what it is that's happening. And you'll just have more fun doing it too, because you'll have more reference points to bounce off of, rather than this singular linear, mindset of like, no, it's this and it doesn't fit this, so I'm just gonna, much better to broaden your worldview.
I'm going to leave you with a last quote, which I think is particularly fitting for you. Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
Is that what we're witnessing before us?
I mean, it's a very true quote. As far you can go back to Méliès making the first films, where people thought it was real, and it was just, they looked at it like magic. They had trains on video, on reels, and a train coming forward towards the camera, and people would run out of the tents because they thought they were going to get hit by a train. To them that was magic, and it was just advanced science. So definitely. But I also think that science can be magical. I think that the truth, even though is science oriented or data oriented, I don't think you have to be disenchanted by it just because something is proven to be right or wrong. I think it's all really magical, because at the end of the day, we don't know. We'll never know fully until, we move on. There's this ongoing quest of trying to find out. But I mean, just the very nature of that alone, that the second we cease to be here, that's magic. Whatever happens after is magic to us still, right? That's not going anywhere. And there's one more that I think is really interesting. We magicians often say this. We say any insufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology, meaning that magicians are out there performing tricks, but if the tricks are bad, then people will just think it's your phone's doing it.
Chris, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I'm really happy we got to talk.
Thanks.
We can do it again someday. And if for the audience, anybody who's not familiar with your work, where should they go to check out your stuff?
Yeah, thank you. Check out Area 52 Investigations on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you listen to your stuff, and I'll be there. Thank you, Rob, so much for this, and thank you for lending me an ear, and obviously for bringing your audience in to hear what I have to say. It means a lot, and I appreciate you guys. Appreciate you. Thanks so much.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you next time.